All right, sounds like the sound is on. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today here at the American Security Project. For those of you that have never been here before, we were founded back in around 2006 by a few people you may have heard of, one of which was John Kerry, also including Chuck Hagel, Warren Rudman, and we'll go from there. So, that being said, today we're here to discuss Russian disinformation, propaganda, the effect it has on our world, how we should face it as Americans, and how we should assist our allies in facing it as well. We certainly live in interesting times. I think we can all agree on that. But disinformation itself, interesting or not, it's certainly not a new phenomenon. It's something that we have been facing for quite a long time. What is new is our ability to access and receive it. And we're receiving that through things like satellite, we're receiving it through the internet, through social media, through sock puppets, which I'm sure we'll discuss a little later today. But basically what we're seeing now is that the press is no longer a gateway. Walter Cronkite no longer decides what stories are relevant to the American people. People decide the stories that are relevant now. But people are not professional consumers or arbiters of information, and that's important to understand. That's supposed to be the job of the press. Now, there's lots of criticism over what's considered fake news or what press is legitimate or illegitimate or what are even facts nowadays. So hopefully we can help figure out a little bit of how to better discern that and help our allies do the same as well. And given all that disinformation that we're dealing with, Russia has certainly taken advantage of this atmosphere. So I'd like to start off by introducing our panelists, and we will have a short statement to begin with. To my right is Vera Zakem from CNA. She's a research scientist. She's the Director of Strategy and Partnerships for the Center of Strategic Studies. She currently leads CNA's work in assessing internal vulnerabilities to vulnerable populations in Europe and Russia, joint civil affairs, and media and influence. She's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the Pacific Council on International Policy. To her right, we have Jeffrey Trimble from the Broadcasting Board of Governors. He's the IBB Deputy Director. He joined the BBG in 2007 as Director of Programming and later served as Executive Director, managing the board staff and providing strategic guidance and program oversight. Jeff also became the IBB Director in 2012. He worked previously at RFERL for 10 years and prior to that at U.S. News and World Report magazine for 15 years. Helle Dale, to the right, is a Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy at the Heritage Foundation. She joined Heritage in 2002 as a Deputy Director of Heritage's Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies. And after 2005, she was the Director of Heritage's Douglas and Sarah Allison Center of Foreign Policy Studies. And to start us off, I'd like to invite Rasa Jukneviciene up. She's the Vice President of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. She's a former Minister of the National Defense of Lithuania. She's a member of the Lithuanian Parliament, as well as Deputy Chair of the Committee on National Security and Defense, and the head of the CEMAS delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. From 2008 to 2012, she was Lithuania's Minister of National Defense, and she's also a signatory to the Act of Lithuanian Independence signed in March 11th, 1990. So with that, I'd like to invite Rasa up to speak.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to speak in this audience, and especially on the topic, which was not on agenda a few years ago when I was coming to Washington, D.C. as Minister of Defense. It was a little bit out of political correctness to speak about Russian influence at that time. But despite that, what you are discussing now here about Russian influence, we were facing for ages, and especially when Putin came to power. So I would like to start saying that it's nothing very new, maybe very new for America, but in my country since 16th century, Russian propaganda in different ways, without internet, without social media, without TV, was doing exactly the same. And especially, of course, during last century, we are commemorating very sad event this year, 100 year of Bolshevism revolution. And this, after that, lie became a fundament for the country. Unfortunately, I was forced to born because Lithuania was under occupation of Soviet Union when I was born, and half of my life I spent with lies. I mean, newspapers, TV, everything about the United States. We knew that it's a terrible country with bad behavior against black people, and people are fighting for freedom, and they wanted very much to fly to the USSR, but a bad American government, they are not allowing people to go. Of course, I will not go into the details, but nobody trusts. Almost nobody trusts lies in my country from Moscow, because it was very brutal, very unprofessional lies, and we read among lines, and that it was the environment I grew up. That's why in the families we kept the truth about our history, about deportations, about everything we suffered. But today I have to admit it's very important to say, to underline that the lies they are providing from Kremlin today, they are much more professional. Unfortunately, especially people in Russia, it's a surprise for me. I can't understand why, but very many of them, they trust what they see on TV. Of course, Baltic states, yes, we are frontline. We know what does it mean, information warfare. But Ukraine, I think, is the main arena today, fighting everything related with democracy. And we feel ourselves in Lithuania that Ukraine is frontline, going to defend democracy, and the United States as well. So if you would ask me what to do, first of all, how to fight propaganda and disinformation, I would say that this is the only one symptom of disease. I am a medical doctor, so I will use medical terminology, because it's if you have quite difficult disease, so you have high fever, you are using aspirin against fever, but you are not treating, it's not the fight with the disease. So what do I mean? I mean that Kremlin regime itself, with his hybrid warfare, militarization, occupation of Crimea, and other steps, it's the essence. So we have to think how to fight the essence of the problem. So my proposal is containment, to be backed for the containment, and all possible stages of that are very important. One more thing, if you will allow me, before the discussion. What do I see during the discussions with our partners? We have to agree on terminology. When we say Russian media, we have to know what do we have in mind. Of course, those people, they are providing from opposition some newspapers, information, it is media. But Kremlin-owned channels, TV channels, internet, other things, it's not media. We have to realize that it's weapons. I would say weapons of brain mass destruction. If we agree on that, then we can use right treatment. We are not allowing cross our borders with weapons of mass destruction. But in every room of every hotel, we have RT, which is not media. Why? Kremlin sponsored by billions of dollars, not only RT, but other all the system. Why it is media. So when we will decide that, then we will have right decisions how to act solving these problems. And on Lithuania. The main targets in my country today are our NATO membership, the United States, and if somebody thinks that Baltic states are the main target, it's not true. We are only instrument, how to say, to test NATO, to test the United States. The main target is democracies, democratic world and Western values via Baltic states. So for them, it's utmost important for Kremlin to enlarge influence of corruption, enlarge influence of non-democratic governments around Russia, and to keep going regime, kleptocratic regime as it is now in Russia. So their targets and narratives in Lithuania are that we are almost failed states, that our success is not success of our membership in EU and NATO, our history, it was no occupation, that we voluntarily joined Soviet Union in '94, our partisans, Forest Brothers, like fascists. We are like almost fascist or something like that. Our politicians are very weak and so on and so on. So I know that you have a lot to speak. Thank you for invitation. If somebody will have some questions about our experience, which we have fighting with disinformation and not only fake news. Fake news is not the problem because we can recognize them very well, but we still are facing projects related not only with disinformation, but disinformation like a tool to implement, for example, Russian energy influence, Russian energy projects, Rosatom projects. And we had several of them. Unfortunately, we lost because of the reasons. I will not go into the details. So thank you very much and good luck.
And we will have time for Q&A at the end. So I'd like to, in order, we'll move down our table here, and I'll ask each of our panelists to speak for about 10 minutes on various issues surrounding propaganda and disinformation, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. Vera.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here to talk about this very important topic. I've had the pleasure at CNA to be examining, and other organizations examining, propaganda and disinformation holistically, but when I think about specifically Russian propaganda disinformation vis-a-vis Europe, and certainly I'm sure we'll be having a conversation about the impact here at home in America, but I really would have to agree with you. I think this is so much broader than fake news and what we think of the classic terms of disinformation. This is a broader, Russia is engaged in a broader influence campaign, and let's be clear about that. And it is to discredit Western institutions. It is to undermine the foundation, the elements of democracy or Western democracy, what those elements that we hold true in the Western society. However, what I'll mention a little bit is that Russia uses different elements of influence and different nodes of influence, and they're not uniform across the board. Certainly not uniform in Europe. Certainly we discovered here, even in America, as diverse as this country is, it is not uniform as well. So let me just I'll structure my remarks as, just tell you a little bit about how I view disinformation and propaganda. Again, certainly it's not new to Europe. And then just also talk a little bit about Russian compatriots in certain countries that have been targets of Russian propaganda disinformation, particularly Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Latvia, and Estonia. Again, it's not all of European countries, but just to give you an example of how that particular population has been dealing with disinformation and propaganda from Russia. So first and foremost, what is Russian disinformation and propaganda? It is really to instill fear and confusion in the audience. It is done in a number of ways. One is to create alternative viewpoints, right? So on social media platforms, major outlets. So you're not really fact-checking information, but more importantly than fact-checking, you're actually not thinking critically about where that information is coming from. I think one of the bigger issues that we need to be addressing and when we're dealing with propaganda and disinformation writ large, generally speaking, is the lack of critical thinking that exists in societies. And I'm not just talking about whether enhancing that as a skill in professional journalism, but also in our youth as well. And again, this can be not just here in the US, in Europe, and all over the world. Because when we think about social media, for example, when we get into an issue is what I like to say is we don't think before we click. And I think there is an element of that. So critical thinking is important. But going back, we kind of, with our election and Russia's alleged involvement in our election, we kind of woke up to disinformation and propaganda, and we're still discussing and debating and investigating all of this. However, Europe has been dealing with this in Europe for a very long time, certainly for over a decade. I mean, we can look at examples in Estonia. In 2007, that was a cyber attack, but that also included broader influence campaign that included disinformation and propaganda. Of course, when we think about the Russia-Georgia war in 2008, both Russians and Georgians were engaged in a pretty holistic and comprehensive combination, what I would call a hybrid warfare, where there was cyber attacks, there was full-on information operations and disinformation, as well as military action as well. And then, of course, Ukraine. Whether we're talking about the MH17, the annexation of Crimea, there was constant, and it was so constant where it was almost impossible to respond. But also let me take you a little bit to the Balkans as well. In my work, I've had a wonderful opportunity to travel throughout Europe, whether it's Baltics, Balkans, and other parts of the former Soviet Union space. And the one thing I notice is that Russia uses those elements of influence when it comes to this broader influence in very different ways. So for example, in the Balkans, when we're talking about the Macedonia or Serbia, as an example, you don't have these ethnic Russian populations. But what you have is close Russian ties, whether it's through economic sector, energy sector, security sector, certainly I'm thinking of Serbia, and where you have, for example, in Macedonia, where you have this ethnic conflict between Macedonia and Albania. And Russia has asserted itself in this ethnic conflict. It's just to give you one example, to try to sway certain populace. And when I was certainly in Skopje, I saw that very much as well. So again, why does Russia do this? Thinking a little bit more holistically about now ethnic Russians, but I think this can be applied across the board when we think about Russian influence operation. It is really just to figure out who it can influence and how. Again, in some cases, it will be propaganda, disinformation. In other cases, it's going to be via energy ties, or perhaps it's economic interests, or via political parties. But those nodes of influence are going to be used differently across the board in different countries in the European continent. Now, when we think about, just one last point I'll make, and then happy to follow on in the Q&A. When we think about how Russia exerts influence, now, if Russia perceives that, especially the ethnic Russian community, but also in other populations, there are perceived grievances, but there's not getting certain needs met from that particular host country, Russia will use that as a blunt instrument of influence. And then flip the coin, I would say that if there are close ties between, say, Russian oligarchs, or those who monopolize the media, or business owners, maybe perhaps there are close ties to the political parties, Russia can use those relationships as a connection. And for intelligence gathering, cooperation, and through other means. And then the last point I'll make on the broader influence, and I do think it's a part of a broader disinformation propaganda campaign that just goes beyond the fake news phenomenon. And let's talk about all the different other techniques that Russia has. What about Rasa Jukneviciene, which exists within the Russian government, and it's an agency. It has sort of ties between the Russian compatriot populations and Russia. And then, again, business interests. And then there's something called Ruski Mir, which is Russian world. Again, connecting the diaspora, the Russian diaspora around the world. so that there's a bigger world outside of Russia that connects those. And again, those populations, whether they have a sort of affiliation or close likeness, if you will, to Putin and the Russian government, they serve as indirect nodes of influence, and we cannot forget that. So when I think about Russian disinformation and propaganda, I don't just think about fake news and what we see and how that's reinforced in just social media, but I like to think about it as a holistic, as you may refer to as a disease. It is a disease in the sense that even if you were just to target the media and RT and Sputnik, it's not going to eradicate Russian influence. You have to look at it strategically, systematically, and in a targeted way. Stop it.
Jeff?
I'm a broadcaster. Mic check. Are you okay? Before we get started, I'm really pleased to share a stage with such distinguished experts as Vera and Helle. And Madam Minister, I also can't miss the opportunity to express our appreciation to the government of Lithuania and also to Lithuanian media outlets with whom we partner very closely in U.S. international broadcasting in our efforts to counter Russian disinformation. So thank you very much to you, your government, and also media outlets in Lithuania. And I can't pass the opportunity to take note of just one individual in this audience who's made such an important historic contribution to U.S. international broadcasting. And there are many folks here, but I want to single out Kevin Close, former president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who's here today, and who, for better or worse, got me into this business 20 years ago. So thank you, Kevin, very much, and thanks for taking time to come. So I'm going to very briefly review three things and then look forward to coming back in Q&A. I'm going to review briefly what U.S. international media, U.S. international broadcasting is today, because I think it's extraordinarily important that everyone understand the lane in which we operate as part of the bigger picture of what's happening to respond to Russian disinformation and other things around the world. So that's number one. And second, I'll say a few things specifically about what U.S. international media have done in response to Russian disinformation. And finally, I'll touch on the issue of metrics. How can we tell if we're succeeding or not? But I'll touch on that very lightly, and we'll look forward to a richer discussion about that when it comes around to the Q&A time here. So as far as U.S. international broadcasting goes, I said I'd talk about what we do, but it's easy to start with talking about what we don't do. What we don't do is propaganda. And we don't do propaganda. There's no evidence that countering propaganda with propaganda is an effective measure. In fact, there's considerable research and indication that throwing propaganda out to counter propaganda actually hurts the cause of truth in the long run. And in fact, it plays into the hands of the techniques and the approaches that governments such as the Russian government and, for that matter, ISIS use. So we don't do propaganda in U.S. international media. Just quickly, U.S. international media today is the Broadcasting Board of Governors. That's the name of the agency. And it includes 5 media networks. Think of BBG as a holding company. Those 5 networks are, of course, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, Al Hura TV, and Radio Sawa. These are our Arabic broadcasters under Middle East Broadcasting Networks, and Radio and TV Marti under the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. These modern media organizations provide content through digital platforms, television and radio today in 61 languages. That's far more than any other country. To more than 100 countries, and we reach a measured audience. Here's my first metric. We reach a measured audience of more than 278 million people each week, and that's an increase of 52 million just in the past year. Our legislation calls on us to do 3 very specific things. Number 1, we are called on to inform people through accurate, objective, and comprehensive news. Number 2, we're required to represent American society, culture, and thinking. We think of this as the fullness of the American experience. Some would call it telling America's story. And finally, we're required to present and discuss U.S. policy. So present U.S. policy and responsible discussion around that policy. And this is reflected in our mission statement to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. And now the very important why. Why does approximately $750 million a year of U.S. taxpayer money go to support this? The networks of U.S. international media advance U.S. national interests by providing audiences in closed societies or where free media is not yet fully established with consistently accurate and compelling journalism and content that opens minds and stimulates debate. We demonstrate to the world values that reflect our society, freedom, openness, and democracy. And we find that societies that embrace these values support U.S. interests because they enjoy greater stability and prosperity, they tend to live in peace with their neighbors, they reject terrorism and extremism, and they make better political allies and trade partners for the United States. So that's how it cashes out. That's the top line on U.S. international media today and what we're called on to do. Russia is one of the 5 stated priorities of U.S. international media today. That should come as no surprise. The others are Cuba, countering violent extremism, Iran, China, and now by extension we've added North Korea to that. These are the areas on which we're concentrating the bulk of our efforts today, while not abandoning our historic commitment to other parts of the world. On Russia, Vera was speaking about Ruski Mir. Russian language makes sense as a global play for news and information in and of itself because it's the 8th most spoken language in the world. There are different figures on this, but if you include everyone who speaks it fluently as a second language, such as in the former Soviet space, it rises to the 5th most spoken language in the world. So in and of itself, a strong global media play in the Russian language makes business sense, separate and apart from policy goals. But I would emphasize that we're not increasing our Russian language content for audiences around the world at the expense of the other languages in which we broadcast. In fact, our Russian language content is stronger and better thanks to the outstanding work that's done in those other languages, because content that starts out in Chechen can be leveraged into Russian and reach larger audiences around the world, and in fact be leveraged beyond that into English and reach still larger audiences around the world. So the historical commitment in U.S. international broadcasting to reaching people in the languages they speak, sitting at the kitchen table, talking with their family and friends about what matters that day, remains very much a focus of U.S. international broadcasting. There is no one-size-fits-all response to what the Russians are doing in the media space. We're often asked the question, what are you doing to counter RT? And it's not a quick answer, and I'm not going to give you a really quick answer right now. We're doing a whole host of things to counter RT. And in part, that's because the Russians themselves have a far more complex system of platforms and outlets than RT. I would submit to this group, and interested in the reaction of my fellow panelists, in fact, it's Russia's domestic media operating in the former Soviet space and reaching audiences around the world that arguably has a far greater impact than RT does in terms of setting an agenda and providing information. And also, the reason one-size-fits-all doesn't work in responding to RT is it doesn't address the realities of today's media world, which, as we all know, is becoming increasingly fractionalized, and there are micro products out addressing each and everything. So there's no one-size answer to RT. I also need to point out that much of what RT does is not in the theater of operations, if you will, of U.S. international broadcasting. If you were listening when I described the places to which we broadcast, that we reach with our content, it's not the fully developed functioning democracies anchored in Western institutions that are the primary targets of RT. U.S. international media does not strive to reach audiences in the UK or Denmark or Australia or Canada. Those aren't our target areas. Those are the target areas of RT. So we need to be clear on the kind of asymmetry in talking about U.S. international media necessarily as a response to RT. So since the Russian aggression in Crimea and eastern Ukraine and the upscaling of Russian disinformation efforts, our language services, and I'm speaking of the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, have launched or expanded more than 35 new programs to reach Russian speakers worldwide. with balanced, accurate, topical, and trustworthy information. I'm going to very quickly name some of the key efforts, but by no means all. I think many of you have heard of the Current Time project, Nastoящее время in Russian. This was formally launched in February of this year. It is a 24/7 Russian language television and digital news channel and branded programs produced by RFERL in partnership with VOA, something also new for U.S. international broadcasting. This isn't called RFERL or VOA. It's called Current Time. It's a new brand. This network is carried, the television product, by 40 providers in 13 countries, in addition to global smart TV over-the-top providers as well. More than 30 stations in 14 countries are carrying programs from the stream. This is no-spin news and coverage that focuses in particular on stories that Russia's media does not cover. I would say it's aimed at three audiences. It's aimed at Russian speakers in the former Soviet space, who are first and foremost the target of that pernicious Russian domestic media. Of course, it targets Russia itself, and it targets Russian speakers wherever they may happen to be on the face of the globe, working at a coffee shop in Seattle or changing planes in Vienna, taking their phones out of their pockets and checking their Current Time app to see what the latest news headlines are. I'd like to say as well that Current Time is a force multiplier for independent Russian media, in that it succeeds, and we've been able to do it with the resources available in large part because we take content created by independent media outlets around the world and put it into the Current Time stream, including a Baltic Week program produced by Lithuanian media outlets, a program on how to start a business produced by Hromadska TV in Ukraine in Russian language. They produced the program for us, and others. We have research in the field now about Current Time, but I can share a few initial indications about success of the network. The digital component of the Current Time project, Digim, which engages audiences by taking content out of the television stream and creating original content as well, and distributing through Facebook, Contact, YouTube, others. They've had 160 million views of streamed content in the first 5 months of this year. So it is reaching significant audiences, and later this year we'll have in-country research about viewership of the television content, but I have some as well. Just quickly, polygraph.info actually is an English language product that is a fact-checking website produced by RFERL and VOA, launched late last year. It serves as a resource for combating and knocking down disinformation put out by Russia. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, looking at a different model, has launched a Central Asia wire service, which sends out content to more than 1,100 subscribers at 700 media outlets in Central Asia in Russian, as well as Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Tajik, and Uzbek, giving them an alternative to Russian content that they've been taking. So rather than creating programming ourselves, we're serving as a wire service. It's a somewhat different model for U.S. international media. In response to what's happened in Ukraine, RFERL has launched an independent stream called Donbass Realities in Russian for the East, and Crimea Realities for Crimea. The Crimea Realities content actually is in 3 languages: Russian, Ukrainian, and Crimean Tatar. We are in Belarus on the air for the first time ever. We broadcast cross-border to Belarus for decades, but Voice of America Russian content is now on the air on Belarus state television nightly, and that's a first for U.S. international broadcasting. I don't want to not miss English language teaching, which is an important component of what U.S. international media does, and there's increasing interest in that. We're also creating a lot more Russian language content that's specific to the countries where we broadcast. So if you look at a country like Moldova, for more than 6 decades, RFERL has done Romanian language content for Moldova. RFERL now does Russian language targeted information specific for Moldovan audiences. And then there's the Current Time project, which is the global play that's available on cable there as well. We're on 120 media outlets in Ukraine. The Current Time channel is on Volya, which is the most popular cable network in Ukraine. And we are somewhat out of area with the Current Time project in that we've sought and found placement for the network in Germany, in the Netherlands, in UK, and Israel. So places where there are large Russian-speaking populations who are looking for alternate sources of news and information, and we're also doing so-called hospitality play. So when Russians check into their hotels in Stockholm and turn on the TV in their room, the Current Time channel will be there. So that's a quick overview of some of the highlights of what we've done so far in response, and I've gone on a little bit long, so let me just say about impact that operating in these repressive media environments for the most part around the world, we're particularly challenged in measuring the success of what we do. So we've looked at this really closely, and in fact we've made it a top strategic priority of the agency to measure impact. We've had an impact model since 2012, but we revisited it in 2016, and you can find detailed information on the bbg.gov website about the model. But we now have a model that examines 11 core and 28 optional quantitative and qualitative indicators. It's a very rich matrix of indicators that we're analyzing to assess the success of our content. So this includes the results of surveys, digital metrics, qualitative research, anecdotal evidence. We're able to estimate weekly audience size, but it also includes measures of credibility, uniqueness of coverage, audience participation rates, whether content's being shared, whether content prompts some form of action, such as adopted behavior somewhere, or a policy change, or a cultural shift. We even take as an impact indicator when Russian state television devotes a substantial part of its Sunday night feature news program to denouncing the Current Time project. We take that as an impact indicator because it's obviously making enough of a difference that they need to pay attention to it and say something about it. After which, by the way, Current Time's digital reach increased in Russia. So there. We can come back to these topics in further discussion. I think that's a quick overview, and I look forward to following up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. The topic, obviously, is extremely timely, and I wanted to reflect a little bit on the current situation that we find ourselves in here in Washington, debating Russian propaganda and putting it in the context of Russian propaganda as we have known it for quite some time. As both Rasa and Vera mentioned, Russian propaganda is nothing new, but it just seemed like in the last year that we here in Washington and the United States have woken up to it, because we find ourselves probably in the midst possibly of the biggest success story that Russian propaganda has had for a very long time. Whoever thought this up in the Kremlin, whatever impact they thought they would have on the US election, they have now managed to make a lot of Americans extremely confused about the state of their own democracy. That is hitting a bull's eye. I sort of like to think of it, maybe in the Kremlin they're thinking about the confusion they have sown here in Washington and the American political system as the surprise Osama bin Laden might have had when he watched the Twin Towers come down. Because it really has, I think, shaken a lot of Americans in their view of their own system. We're still trying to sort out the consequences, and ultimately there'll be enough blame to go around many, many times. But still, for those of us who have studied Russian propaganda for some time, this is an extraordinary situation to find yourself in. Of course, Russian propaganda was preceded by Soviet propaganda. Only we seem to have forgotten that as in the 1990s, early 21st century, we assumed that that kind of ideological, intellectual warfare had more or less disappeared from the scene. And then we started hearing from our friends in the Baltics and our friends in Central and Eastern Europe that no, actually, the Russians are still going at it. In 2010, I wrote with a colleague from the Heritage Foundation a paper on Russian anti-Americanism, a priority target for US public diplomacy. If I could just quote, not too many people were interested back then, but this is what we wrote. The Kremlin is using anti-Americanism as a strategic tool for pursuing domestic and foreign policy goals. through media controlled or owned by the state. The Russian government is deliberately spreading poisonous anti-US propaganda at home and abroad, blaming many of Russia's problems on the West, particularly the United States. There is a lot to be recognized here. Of course, the Russian President Vladimir Putin was part of the Soviet propaganda machine as a KGB man, and is therefore probably the greatest world leader expert on how to influence public opinion in other countries. It's important to see this context, I think, for the way we're analyzing our current predicament, and also to understand how either the Russians got very lucky or they understand maybe even better than ourselves our political differences in the United States, which have created an elaborate, exacerbated ripple effect stemming from some of what Russia was doing during the US presidential election. Russia's concept of propaganda, as Vera said, plays into its overall foreign policy. In the Russian 2013 foreign policy concept paper, it outlined where that fits in. To quote, Russia will seek to ensure its objective perception in the world, developed in its own effective means of information influence on public opinion abroad, strengthen the role of Russian mass media in the international information environment, providing them with the essential state support, as well as actively participate in international information cooperation, and take necessary measures to counteract information that threats the sovereignty and security of Russia. It is an integral part of Russian foreign policy. 2 months after Russia's invasion of Crimea, Putin awarded the Order of Service of the Fatherland to around 300 journalists. Their service to the fatherland included friendly coverage of the Russian invasion, and the media was a key piece of the hybrid attack plan against Ukraine. We have heard here occasionally from people who have worked within the Russian propaganda machine. One of those people, former Russian TV producer Peter Pomerantsev, has described how the Russian media industry simply controls in a vertical way the media content, sometimes making things out of whole cloth, simply to confuse, to influence. Sometimes I wonder if not confusion is actually the bigger part of the picture and the strategy, because it makes all of us, to some degree, simply doubt the information that we receive. Some propaganda campaigns are very, very elaborately manufactured, come out of just absolutely thin air. Let me give you a few examples of a couple of completely manufactured news stories that made the rounds worldwide. In April 2015, Russian media reported that a 10-year-old Ukrainian girl had been killed by Ukrainian bombing in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. It was a terrible case. A BBC reporter tried to track down the story and even traveled there to talk to the girl's family. After some investigation, it was found she didn't even exist. The story was a complete fabrication. Another very interesting example focused here in the United States on the 13th anniversary of the September 11 attacks. Social media was percolated with reports of a toxic leak from the Colombian chemicals plant in Centerville, Louisiana, on the Gulf Coast. People in the area were deeply perturbed, and the rumors were fueled by a range of sources, from YouTube videos of fake CNN news coverage, to tweets, to local journalists, to text alerts, to residents. It was later investigated, reported, and according to the New York Times Magazine, it all originated in a Russian internet troll farm. To have things that look so credible in a very fluid media environment, needless to say, makes you kind of doubt a lot of what you read anyway. But in countries with free media, where access to multiple news sources can expose the truth, Russian strategic communications cannot fully convince audiences that its version of events are truthful. The design may therefore well be, in the case of the United States or Europe, to create enough uncertainty to doubt the existence of objective truth, and sometimes trust more in outlandish conspiracy theories, to doubt the reality of your own news services, of the truth as it appears around you, in turn saps ideological opposition to the Russia's narratives and innovates the standing of U.S. and U.S.-friendly governments in the region, either here in the United States or in Europe. And it will also be recalled that France was also a subject of a Russian propaganda attack during its recent election. A lot of examples, in fact quite a few of them, relating to the U.S. election, and it makes for an interesting study, can be found in the report on U.S.-Russian interference in the 2016 election by the U.S. intelligence services. About 20% of the report compiles instances from RT, sowing doubt about the U.S. system. And it's worth reading for many reasons, but also because it's fairly typical of the way the Russians operate. RT is on many networks here. It is accessible. It is not against the law. And yet these reports percolate and are readily available, from doubting the legitimacy of our voting machines to undermining the U.S. two-party system, to characterize the United States as a surveillance state. There are many, many of those kind of germs of doubt about a political system that will percolate via RT. I certainly invite you to go back and look at them yourselves. And just as a final note on what RT is doing, the most recent update that I heard on the news yesterday was that it's giving Jesse Ventura, former pro wrestler, his own program. He's going to be traveling throughout the United States, showing Russians what the United States is all about. And there is a man to tell the American story for the rest of the world. So I'll stop here so you'll have some time for Q&A.
Well, from wrestler to governor, I don't know what's more American than that. So we're going to go straight into audience Q&As. I'm going to forego my moderator's privilege of asking questions. But the rule is, phrase your question in the form of a question. That means no speeches. I will interrupt you if you give a speech. So questions. Gentleman right here. And please wait for the roving microphone.
Hi, I was wondering what efforts are being done to connect with influencers within the Russian community. I know there's Alex Navalny and especially YouTube vloggers who are getting a lot of attention. Moscow Times came out with an article a couple weeks ago talking about how the Kremlin is approaching YouTube vloggers. So what is America's approach to that, or response?
Well, I guess I could take that first and welcome my colleagues' comments on that. As part of the mandate that we have to do high-quality news and information, we're going to seek and put on the air everybody's views we can get on any given issue, so that, if you will, can cash out to people like Navalny and others in the opposition who might not be able to get to the microphones of other outlets, can reach Russian-speaking audiences through our programming in the balanced context of what our programming is. So we're not phrasing ourselves as what in the old days somebody might have called opposition radio, but we're charged with doing the whole story, with doing no-spin news. So we are going to make an effort to get all voices at the microphone, including those of opposition figures and those who can't get their views out there. And this would have to do with social issues and other things as well. We've had issues recently, gay rights in Chechnya, for instance, the crackdown there. This is a topic that we've covered in great detail and one that gets covered in a very, very slanted way in Russian media.
Other questions? Nelson Cunningham, the president of American Security Project.
Yeah, thank you. I am the president, although Steve Cheney does all the work, and Matthew and his team. I'm really proud of this program in particular. This is so substantive. My question for you is this. The interference in last November's election was, in some senses, fairly benign, in the sense of emails were hacked and then were dumped out on the street. They don't appear to have been falsified. They don't appear to have been jazzed up. It appears to have simply been taken and then strategically put out there. In what you reported here happening in Eastern Europe, and what you reported, Madam Minister, also seems to be a lot less benign. What could we expect next year in the 2018 midterms? What are the sorts of tactics that we as American consumers of information should be worried about and aware of in advance?
Well, if I could reflect on that, I certainly hope that particularly the U.S. media will be highly sensitized to the possibilities of this happening and be more, maybe more critical of the way they handle the information themselves, more circumspect in accepting document dumps. I mean, it was obviously everybody delighted in reading what was going on within the Clinton campaign in almost real time. And journalists from all sorts of sides of the spectrum, reveled in the email dumps. It may be that we as consumers, as producers and consumers of news, need to think hard about how we handle it the next time the Russians come at us with either that or any other aspect of the Russian involvement, which had several prongs beyond the emails.
Yeah, I would concur on that point. I think we as an American society, and by we, I mean we as active citizens, users, journalists, government officials, everyone, educators, youth. I think because as a result of what's happened in 2016 election, I think folks are going to be much more sanitized and more sensitive, hopefully, to think critically about what's being put out. And what we, not just by mainstream media, but what is even shared on social media. As we've learned, certainly, so Twitter has always been a pretty big, if you will, outlet and platform, as well as Facebook, for sharing information, and that information just spreads in nanoseconds. And sometimes we don't take time to actually think critically and stop and think about what is actually happening. So I think that's going to be critical, and I think to what you also mentioned, I think if we can take one lesson from the former Soviet Union space and from the States, it's that when we talk about fake news and disinformation, let's think about it when we think about the midterms and going forward in a more holistic fashion. It can happen in the economic sphere. There might be other tentacles that might be supporting a disinformation campaign, whether it's political, economic, security, energy, and other means.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, Pascal Siegel from Ankara Consulting. I want to know, you have given a lot of examples of political meddling, disinformation. Have you ever come across commercial disinformation? Again, targeting economic interests.
I think the minister touched on some of the economic issues pertaining to the Baltics, which have been certainly spun strongly by Russian media. I think the Baltics are a place where there would be examples that could be found of that. That's what comes to my mind first, as part of, again, kind of hybrid warfare, if you will, looking for the levers to pull in the former Soviet space, that the media would be supporting, the Russian media would be supporting in the way it talks about some of these issues, the pipelines, for instance, transshipment issues and things, those kinds of things. That would be an area to look at.
And and cyber attacks as well, I would think.
Cyber attacks are particularly relevant today, considering the hack that went on yesterday and continuing into today. Yeah, absolutely. Can you bring the microphone back?
Triad shortly. When I say that fake news is not the biggest problem when we speak about disinformation propaganda, I have in mind that Kremlin is able to create more broader projects related with their interests in different countries. Energy is one of the main tools, or was one of the main tools of Putin's Russian Federation to give influence, to make influence, especially in neighboring countries. So we had, I can give you an example, and you can read more or contact me via Facebook later or Twitter on a few examples. One of them was related very much with the United States. In year 2000, we started the first project to diminish Russian control in oil, our oil dependence, and we wanted to sell our state-owned oil refinery to American company Williams. And that was a huge project against Americans. Your former ambassador to Lithuania made a huge study on that because we were not ready on that. Millions of dollars were spent from Kremlin side to stop this project. Now, recently we had a project related with our new nuclear plant, when we had to stop our Ignalina nuclear plant because of old-style Soviet reactors, and without that we would not be able to join the European Union. And instead of that, we wanted to build up new one with Japanese investments. And of course it was against Rosatom interests, and they were able, via our politicians, unfortunately, and media, not only Russian media, but also Lithuanian media, with huge amount of money, what to hide, to organize a referendum, and people were scared. A lot of details I could tell, but it's not a panel for that. I just conclude saying that this project also was related with disinformation, with influence, with secret services, with briberies, with influence for the politicians, and we lost, unfortunately. My government, we lost this referendum, and until now we don't have our own new nuclear plant, but 50 kilometers from Vilnius, our capital, only 50 kilometers in Belarus side, Kremlin is building a not safe nuclear plant which can be used as a tool for hybrid warfare, for things we even difficult to imagine. So we had few projects, not only Chevron, investigation for shale gas in our country also was related with the massive protests from population, with burning water, from the pipes and so on and so on.
Great. So with that, we'll wrap things up today. I think a concluding thought we might all want to think about on this is, well, it's thinking. Think before you click, think before you share, and think 3 times before you enter your password. It's important.